Hi, folks. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We have a thin crowd right here. I guess it's.
There's a conference at NYU.
Sorry?
There's a conference at NYU today.
Oh, just I thought only a couple of people were going there. Not to worry, they're not going to be docked too much. So now today what we have is, this is the class 12 on risk management, on adaptation, how to manage kind of a changing climate. And the focus is not going to be just on climate change, because I kind of walk you through. Change also involves variability, which a lot of folks who may not have had the background don't realize. It also mainly it's expressed through variability of climate, seasonal interannual variability. And also it's important to recognize not to focus only on climate, but also to focus on other aspects of economy, society that also are undergoing change. One of the issues that we find when people focus on managing the risks of the climate is to exclusively focus on climate as though that's the only single dynamic driving development. Here in this class, given the interest of the MDP network and of the class, I'm really going to be focusing on developing countries. And to make real what so far has been a very good set of lectures, but with some feedback, to make real, give you a concrete example of what do you consider, how do you kind of go about managing these risks, rather than in the abstract. I want to kind of make it real, and then in the follow-on hour, we could have more discussion. Okay, so now, Denise. This one. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So there was a lot of interest in the Obama-Xi declaration, more of an announcement and more of kind of intentions. What is it and what does it mean? So I'm going to spend exactly 2 minutes, because that is important, but it's not quite related to the kind of climate risk management. Adaptations really kind of, it has enormous implications for mitigation. So what the announcement did, and it's not really more than a set of intentions that the two leaders have declared, is for the 2005 level for the US, which by the way was, in terms of emission, was a kind of higher than normal year, that it would reduce its emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 level by 2025. Okay, so in just over 11 years. And to make best efforts to reduce its emissions by kind of 28%, whereas China has given its set of kind of announced its set of intentions is to achieve the peaking of carbon dioxide or equivalent by 2030. It's not announced as to where it's going to peak, but that it will be peaking at 2030, followed by a decline, and that it would increase, and this is fairly important, it would increase the non-fossil fuel part of the primary energy by 20%, which for such a large economy is going to be a huge undertaking. Okay, and also, so this was really an important political statement for both sides and for the world. So what are some initial reactions? Initial reactions have been very positive, as you see here. UN Secretary General has kind of lauded the leadership of these two leaders, and he actually says that then that would set the stage for other countries to follow. Hopefully that would happen. And our own kind of Professor Jeff Sachs, in his write-up at the Financial Times, has said that it's a major step forward, and also observers in Asia have welcomed this. Among scientists, there is more of a mixed reaction. Those who are following the energy pathways of both the OECD as well as non-OECD countries have said, well, this is, while it's good, it's a little bit more of the same, not really kind of dramatic, and it doesn't really portend to make use of best global practices that's already available to have either kind of better energy efficiency or decoupling the energy production from carbon. Doesn't really make use of global best practices. And of course, our kind of the US GOP congressional leaders have pounced on this, and they lost no time in saying, oh, this is terrible for the country, for the common working person, and then how they're going to kind of try to stop it. It's not clear they can actually stop it because it doesn't really depend on the kind of the U.S. Congress voting on anything major, but it's not good to have the opposition, and now in a fair degree of kind of control of both the upper and the lower houses here in the U.S. immediately kind of declare this as a kind of a no-starter. So what's involved is, if you look at the graphs, yeah, you have China, which they've promised it will peak someplace by 2030, and the U.S. has said that it will start kind of peaking. The pledge to China was that it would cut emissions by 26%, and this is very much along the target that Obama declared back in 2009. So in that sense, it's not kind of dramatic, okay? But this is important, and globally, this is adapted from IEA and DDPP. You have had people, both Lawrence Tubiana and Emmanuel, kind of reflect on this in a previous class. It is what the 6, 4, and 2 degree scenarios. They just reflect 6 degree scenarios is business as usual. Countries are not going to do anything. 4 degrees is what they have pledged, and this is before the most recent pledge of last week. So this does not include that. What these the 7 countries, what they have pledged, if they carry that out, where it's going to peak by 20, where it's going to be at 2050, not peak, where it's going to be at 2050, and then the 2 degree, what is needed here. Hey, oh, it went back. This is very tricky. Hola. Oh, lovely. Okay, so 2 degree. Denise, I'm not going to touch this. And then and the deep decarbonization effort that is having these 15 countries kind of run these deep decarbonization pathways. Where's that going to be? Okay, so it's much to be done, but it's kind of important to recognize that this was a fairly important decision, and giving kind of what people hope is a political kickstart. May not be kind of scientific, but politically kind of kickstart to what otherwise has been a kind of a what in New York would be called as a ho-hum set of negotiations. Along with that was also something that did not quite capture as much interest amongst those people who actually are following mitigation, is this pretty important announcement that President Obama made in terms of US contribution to Green Climate Fund. That they're going to be, again, the intention, again, this is not a pledge, this is a pre-pledge, because the pledge comes up next week, that US would be contributing $3 billion. And this, I think, was touched upon by Lawrence Tubiana, who is part of the Green Climate Fund that comes out of Cancun in 2010. And the idea is by 2020, not too far off, there's going to be $100 billion annually, combination of both developed OECD countries, Annex 1, as well as some now increasingly developing countries. And the kind of the kicker in this is includes private sector contribution. And that's always been part of the challenge and puzzle, is how are we going to actually kind of get a handle on what the private sector is contributing. Okay, so it's, again, it's kind of important. And where we are as of the 17th of November is there was an intention going in that before the COP, Lima COP, which is next month, Green Climate Fund would have anywhere between 10 to $15 billion in the kitty in terms of pledges. These are not contributions. I'll kind of quickly get to that. These are pledges. And we have all the way from kind of Germany with 750 million kind of equivalent euros, all the way to Japan, which is, again, the Prime Minister has declared Japan's intention to contribute $1.5 billion. Again, it's not, it's a pre-pledge, and they're going to be doing the actual pledging next week. Okay, so these are all important ones, and it looks like by the time Lima COP comes around, there would be around $10 billion. But whether we'll actually reach 100 billion and how that's going to be, and whether, because it's important to keep kind of the momentum, that remains to be seen. And so the Green Climate Fund is actually up and running. They are hiring. Well, when you guys finish your masters. You still have ways to go. You're here first semester, and maybe others who are watching this, you should certainly look up Green Climate Fund, and they are like hiring like there is no tomorrow. I think like 20 plus substantive positions are vacant. But anyway, hopefully Green Climate Fund will be doing well in the years to come. Just a quick word on pledges versus contribution. Pledge is when a head of state goes to these important or his or her emissary and says, okay, my country is going to be pledging X million dollars. And this is not just for climate, it works for everything, for global health funds, global education fund, any kind of multilateral set of pledges. And what is important to recognize is there is a distinct difference between pledging and actual contribution. Pledging also happens over several years. You could say, I'm going to pledge $10 billion over the next 100 years, right? And or it could be $10 billion tomorrow. And then you need to contribute, actually have the money in the kitty. So this is just an example from Clean Technology Fund, where we see that the US pledged around $2 billion and is now still withholding around $600 million of that. Simply, it's not kind of contributed as yet. And these are kind of, these negotiations go back and forth, and I'm sure US has every intention of contributing to the CTF, but it's still not happening. This is not to say that the US is not contributing, because there's a sense that our US doesn't contribute. US actually contributes enormously to multilateral climate and environment funds. Not to say that the US cannot do more, definitely a lot more, both in terms of ODA and in terms of environment climate funds. But the US has been contributing, and here you see, this was a quick summary from 2013 done at the budget office, how across these different budget lines they're all environment and climate related funds, how much US has been contributing. So it's in the tens of millions of dollars every year. Okay, so now we come to kind of climate resilient funds, just as an offshoot of this, before we actually get into CRM. There are many, and this is for the uninitiated. It's very confusing when you first walk into the room and you say, okay, there's lots of money around, so why are people kind of complaining, kind of belly aching? There's lots of money. Well, relative to what needs to be done, it's simply not enough. But we need to make a distinction between UNFCCC process-related funds, that funds that come out of these negotiations internationally. And there is a distinct criteria for new and additional funds, and they have to be focused on, in this case, adapting to climate as a result of climate change. And you have adaptation fund. How many of you here have heard of the adaptation fund? Oh, not bad, because adaptation fund used to be pretty big in the news a few years ago. It was CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism related. It was 2% off the sale of certificates from CDM. But now with the collapse of Kyoto, CDM has kind of dried up, also because of the global kind of carbon price has crashed. So adaptation fund is not doing too well. Now we have the Global Green Fund, 100 billion we just discussed. Then we have donor government sources. Lots of countries, OECD countries especially, provide funds especially for adaptation, risk management, okay? Like Japan is one of the largest, US, UK, Norway, Sweden, and so on, Germany. Then we also have EU contributing quite a lot to these climate resiliency assistance. Then apart from this, we have multilateral funds, both the World Bank, Global Environmental Facility, GF, as well as the regional development banks. Okay, so we have lots of those. They all have different trajectories. They came up, and some of them go back to the early 90s. Some of the GF funds go back long ways. Some of them are focused on specific set of countries, like small island states, LDCs, the Least Developed Climate Fund. There's a special climate change fund. So there are lots of these. And there have been kind of lots of calls to say, can't we just kind of begin to streamline some of them? There are so many, a proliferation of these funds, and can we begin to streamline? But then you kind of talk about other sets of issues, political economy, institutional inertia. It's not easy. Once you have a fund up and running, it takes a fair amount of effort to kind of begin to kind of guide it in a direction other than what it was set up for. But what I want all of you to kind of remember and keep remembering is the biggest donor for climate resiliency are the national governments. Whether they're in Africa, Latin America, or Asia, the national governments, by the very act of development, they contribute the most. there is a tendency amongst people who work on climate risk, to focus only on bilateral, multilateral funds. But actually, if you're able, as development practitioners, if you're able to leverage and to kind of guide these development, the development programmatic funds to do a better job, actually that is an enormous contribution. So keep in mind that when you, for example, when you write your policy briefs, not for this class, but as real policy analysts, policy advisors, seniors, scientific policy, keep in mind that your job is to leverage the governments to do a better job with their funds that they already are putting in. Okay, so now a quick one on risks to development. This is World Economic Forum in Davos every year comes up with what are the key risks to development done by a survey. This is not based on kind of scientific kind of study, but it's based on a survey of, I'll kind of go to who the survey respondents are, but it's interesting to see that now increasingly issues of climate variability, things like that are in the kind of in the green, climate change. They've kind of clubbed a little bit confused. They've clubbed kind of climate change and water stress is different. Extreme weather events is different. Actually, they're kind of in some ways all kind of interrelated, but they are in the upper right quadrant, indicating that they're both high impact and of high likelihood. This is increasing likelihood, and that is increasing impact. So you have a whole set rivaling what, mind you, most of these people are in the business sector. They are all private sector respondents. So even there is a growing recognition. This is not a bunch of kind of goody-goody NGOs who were surveyed, right? None of you, I'm sure, were surveyed. These guys are all kind of hardcore business CEOs who are surveyed, and they've been doing this year after year. And what is interesting here is if you see how has it been, what are the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood over the last, 8 years, from 2007 until 2010, there was no mention, anything. It was as though the private sector respondents didn't realize. And here we talk about the survey respondents. None of you, because it is over 30 is 78%. Dominant, most of them are male, 70% are male. Advanced economies are over 52%. These are people who come from advanced economies. And business is a good 40%, because I think there is in the 8 or 10% did not declare where they are from, whether it's business, government, or NGO. So it could be a little bit higher. But it's interesting to see how there is a growing recognition of the impact of climate, both variability and change, for global risks. Okay, and if you actually go to some of the specific regional risks, it's going to be even more. So this is kind of important for us. So now what we're going to do in the rest of this kind of class is have a very kind of walk you through what is managing risks and building resiliency involved. Okay, so it involves understanding vulnerabilities as well as opportunities, and we kind of walk you through a concrete example. So rather than kind of have this kind of dry set of lectures on how to map vulnerability, how to map risk, I'll just kind of walk you through. You need to identify multiple risks to both people, environment, and economy. That's in keeping with what we would like to do, is not just focus on climate as the key driver. It is an important driver, but we also need to focus on, for example, the risk to kind of food security, because people cannot access the food that's already there, or people cannot harvest on time. So they are less linked to climate, partially maybe linked, but also to do with infrastructure and so on. So we need to focus on those as well. Then we need to plan for resiliency building of institutions and technologies. It's not like a quick win. You go, give them a tool and say, okay, voila, done. You guys are now resilient. It doesn't quite happen that way, right? You need to build institutions. You need to kind of reconfigure institutions, the budgetary lines, and that takes up enormous amount of work. It's much easier as scientists to kind of go in and come up with a really valuable set of scientific evidence, tools, and say, okay, this is what needs to be done. Hold a couple of capacity building workshops, then you go on to your next country or your next problem. But to follow up and make sure that year after year, they're actually using it in the way they're supposed to use and building on scientific evidence. And this is not just for climate. In all of your fields of work you have seen, whether it's education, whether it's health, it's very important to kind of, when you want to change a practice, you want to institutions to adopt best practice, it's not a one-shot deal. And then for the longer term, you really need to be there to implement policies and the kind of build on institutions to advance towards sustainable development. So these are kind of a very simple form. These are kind of the 4 steps. Quick one, you'll see this often when you kind of reading up on adaptation is what I call is a very climate-centric, climate risk-centric view. It's kind of rather, it's useful but simplistic. What it says is that you have a stationary climate, the kind of jiggly line up and down in yellow. Okay, only occasionally does it kind of cross what is kind of societal critical threshold. Okay, and so below that, there is somehow a set of practices have developed for kind of coping with these variations in climate. And given the rising trend, it could be temperature, it could be a decline in precip, you're going to have more and more of the extreme events kind of now getting into the kind of the danger zone. So adaptation involves building resiliency to those sets of additional risks. Why I say it's climate-centric is it looks as though other than climate, the society is kind of not doing much. Usually technology practices, you cannot keep improving. So you don't really have kind of a flat line like that for a critical threshold. You're always, societies are always, unless they are in kind of serious turmoil, society is always kind of doing better. Okay, so this is a very simple way to understand coping mechanisms, coping range. You also have the kind of issues of vulnerability, and you have what is meant for what one needs to do for adaptation. Quick word, how many of you have a background in weather and climate? Not you, Denise. Oh, okay. Minority of two, más o menos half. Okay, maybe you folks are all, the folks who are out on the web may all be kind of masters in climate. I don't know. But let's see, this is a really quick 101. There's always confusion on weather, climate variability, climate change. Okay, so climate is average over many months. The WMO has a specific set of kind of criteria guidance on that. And weather is what happens in the next 1 to 10 days. Extended weather can go a little bit beyond. Climate is between kind of months to strictly kind of climate science. It could be kind of up to decades. And then you have climate change, okay, going from decades to kind of centuries. And when people model this, what's on the right-hand column is what do they model? And these kind of, we have these sophisticated kind of mathematical models. Is the model for weather. They model these kind of atmosphere and land conditions. And for variability, they actually model also bring in ocean and atmospheric, which gives some persistence. So you have a little bit better forecasting. By climate change, in addition to all the physical, chemical processes that they model, what's critical also is they need to model the socioeconomics, the energy intensity, how much of carbon is going to be spewed out. So all of that also needs to be modeled. So with each one of them, it's a very complex set of models, but they all are quite different. You don't kind of take a weather model and run it for 1,000 years and say, okay, you have what you get is a kind of climate change. No, you're completely off the mark because it just models the atmosphere land conditions. And because atmosphere changes quickly, the skill also, the model skill degrades. So beyond 10 days, when somebody says there is a weather forecast, it's really climatology. That means they're just looking at what happened in the last 30 years. They're not really kind of modeling that. Okay, so this is important to kind of keep in mind. And this also is really simple, just to say that climate change and variability are related. They're not somehow orthogonal. Suddenly one fine day you wake up, what is it, Hollywood movie? Ice in New York, and our hero, the valiant hero, a day after tomorrow. Yeah, our valiant hero to save his son or daughter was like going from point A to point B. Some dramatic, I enjoyed it hugely. And everyone was like, whoa, you kind of work on climate? I'm like, not really, not like that guy. But still, it was amazing. It was a pretty good one. It was very niftily done. So what happens is, I mean, just a regionally average kind of temperature, and you have this kind of variations, annual kind of variations, and there is a secular trend. If there is a flat trend, nothing. It's just a variability. But in most countries, there is a secular trend one way or the other. And what you have is, even with the same amplitude, with the trend, you will have new record highs. Okay? But increasingly, we know in climate that because of these processes unleashed by more and more greenhouse gases, there is also going to be increasing kind of amplitudinal variation as well. So variability and change are related. And as practitioners, we need to understand that when you say you're adapting to climate change, you're really adapting to climate variability. Okay, and where climate change is really important is in the design of kind of multi-year, multi-decadal infrastructure plans, land use, water supply systems, where you really need to have a sense of what is the likely scenario in terms of climate and, of course, in terms of economy, say 20, 30, 40 years down the road. Okay, this is kind of counterintuitive. People would think that we have excellent kind of weather forecasting, okay with variability, and climate change is kind of down in the dumps. It doesn't quite happen that way because of the mathematical models and the ability to kind of model these interactions. We actually have excellent seasonal interannual, the first column. We can have 2 months, 3 months ahead for many parts of the world, even in the tropics. It really kind of works well. You have really both a good understanding as well as predictability. And it kind of really is a lot more science needs to be done, decadal, kind of 10 years out. But it improves when you're talking of 40, 50 years out, or kind of a larger, kind of longer timescales. Okay, so now we kind of talk about what is kind of managing risk. What I'll do is I'll kind of walk you through a very concrete example. You've heard of me kind of rushing up and down in the Indonesian countryside. And so what I want to do is kind of bring home what is that we do there and how we kind of actually, what are we doing in this kind of project and what it entails. Okay, so the focus is on central Kalimantan. What you have in green is the province of central Kalimantan, and it used to be called Borneo, the island of Borneo. The island is still called Borneo, and up here are the Malaysian part, and then there is Brunei, and these are the 4 provinces of central Kalimantan. It's a pretty big province, very thinly populated. The equivalent would be if it has 150% of the area of Java, which is down here, which is densely populated. This is Java, and I'm sure you guys are wondering where in heavens is Bali. It's right there. Okay, and it only has 1.5% of the population of Java. It has 150% of the area, 1.5 times, and it has a tiny fraction of the population of Java. This is central Kalimantan, and a good part of that is over 30,000 square kilometers. Is peat forest, and peat is partially decomposed vegetation, which is very, very high in carbon. Because of kind of wet, humid conditions, it never fully decomposes. And so over thousands of years, peat has built up to varying everything from 1 meter to over 10 meters. And the central Kalimantan also is the site for very, very low social and economic development. It has a very low HDI, the Human Development Index. We need to keep that in mind when we talk about adaptation. And it is now, over the last 15 years, is a site of extremely intensive land-based, mainly extractive activities. If you look at palm oil, we'll walk you through what that entails. Palm oil plantations. Indonesia now is the world's largest producer of palm oil, having overtaken Malaysia a couple of years ago. Intensive agriculture, timber, very extremely valuable hardwoods, and mining. So this is all kind of, if you want to call it kind of first generation set of activities. You don't have service-oriented activities when you pick up the phone and call up your bank. Highly, highly unlikely. It'll be somebody in Palangkaraya, which is capital of central Kalimantan, asking you, may I help you, right? You will have it in the Philippines, you'll have it in Ireland, you'll have it in India, you'll have it in many parts of the other countries, but not in central Kalimantan. It's very much primary extractive based. Okay? And also it's a site for REDD+, which is reduced emission and from deforestation degradation. Activities from many donors. We'll kind of walk you through that. Okay, so what we need to keep in mind as we get into adaptation, risk management is what are the challenges? What is happening there historically? Okay, so here it's central Kalimantan is a site for many kind of multiple changes, socioeconomic, political, ecological changes. There have been very large government programs, some of them well-intentioned, some of them foolhardy, some of them kind of plain crazy. Like Mega Rise. Mega Rise was for 1 million hectares of clearing of peatland areas, and there is a slide later on. In order to kind of cut the trees, get the timber out, have 4,000 kilometers of canal so that you can begin to drain the peat, and then have, with a combination of transmigration programs, bringing in thousands of families from Java, Madura, other parts of Java, of Indonesia, so that they can actually grow rice. Completely kind of crazy set, but this started in 1996. Then there is large-scale mining, huge concessions for palm oil, and timber. Okay, and all of this involves massive changes to the ecosystems, canal building, draining of peatland, land use changes, and there's massive amounts of population inflows kind of coming in, for whom this ecology is completely different. They're not what ecology they have kind of grown up around, environment, and a collision of worldviews, both in ecology and community. Okay, and decision making, as many of you know who have been following Indonesia, also in a state of flux. That is, if there is several years ago, end of the post Suharto, the new order, so-called new order regime, there is massive amounts of democratization going on down to the district level. There is huge amounts of planning and a government emphasis at the national, provincial level for development. And in this case, there is a huge emphasis on fire. And we wonder why fire. We'll come to that. Central Kalimantan is kind of eye of the storm for better managing fire. Ecological changes is, if you just look at, I mean, since this is going to be on the web, you guys can kind of look at it a little bit leisurely later on. This basically looks at where are the oil palm leases and the timber leases. They are kind of all over. This is Western, this is Central Kalimantan. They're all over. These are long-term leases. And this, in this part, is over here is what is a blow up of on this one is these are the canals, 4,000 canals neatly kind of cut in and draining the peat, forever kind of changing the landscape, the ecosystem of that place. Okay, so and this happened just over a period of almost just under 4 years in the late 90s. Okay, so tens of thousands of hectares are being converted annually. Now it's estimated that over 2 million hectares of land is converted into palm oil in just in Central Kalimantan. And it also has led to massive orangutan habitat destruction. This, the one here is in the island of Borneo and northern Sumatra, gives you the habitat. This is not to suggest that all of that has been destroyed. That gives the habitat of orangutan. But if you go back to the previous slides, you can see how much of that has been fragmented and completely converted. Okay, and this is classic conversion. Here you have the remains of a primary forest, and you have this massive canal draining kind of water. And usually when you go there, the water is kind of black because of the acidic nature of water. And here you have what finally will happen would be a palm oil plantation kind of coming up. So these are profound ecological changes. These are not like kind of small amounts. And this is not just large concessions. These also happens incrementally through sedentary farmers who kind of come in and 2 hectares at a time, 4 hectares at a time. When you have tens of thousands of farmers doing it, it all kind of adds up. Okay, so the world's attention was drawn to the fires in Sumatra and Kalimantan in 1997. This is from kind of remote sense NASA, which gives you a sense of the scale of haze and upper tropospheric pollution that has massive kind of regional impacts. This blanketed Southeast Asia, and for weeks at a time in 97, and then annually every year, not as intense as this, but every year the regional transportation is really impacted. And this is only because of the forest fires in Sumatra and Kalimantan. And there is massive amounts of carbon emission. As I said early on, peat is mainly kind of carbon. Massive amounts of carbon are released. Indonesia in 1997 was amongst the top emitters of carbon in the world. I say here 13 to 40% because the government of Indonesia hotly contests. They say it was 13% of global emissions. Lots of scientists have now kind of studied it and said it's closer to 3 times that. So imagine Indonesia kind of emitting close to 40% of the global carbon in that 1 year because of these forest fires. So this has kind of enormous climate change implications. This is not some kind of local fires. This is not like fires in mineral forests where you have surface fires, really important for habitat because it destroys the habitat, but it doesn't really, after a couple of weeks, what you have in California, Australia, Canada, after a couple of weeks, it kind of dies out and it is a loss of kind of property and life, but not as devastating as peat forest fires because these fires get into peat and they burn for months on end. Right? So, and Indonesian peatland have a lot more kind of carbon, a lot more peat there. A lot of folks who work on this focus only on the global carbon part, but I think is a mistake. It also has huge local impacts of peat forest fires. In 97, 98, 9 million suffered respiratory problems in Kalimantan. The hospital just could not kind of manage. And massive losses, not just to Indonesia, but also to neighboring Malaysia, Singapore. Billions of dollars of loss, agriculture, tourism, transportation, etc. And again, in Central Kalimantan, highest asthma rate of any province in Indonesia. And this is all government of Indonesia data. So these are huge, really important, not just to local economy, national economy, but also kind of regional society and economy. Okay. And why do fires happen? That's because the peatlands have been kind of are draining because of what we saw, because of the mega rice areas. They're at greater fire risk because they're drier now than ever have been before. Every year, annually, they dry up. Human activity triggers fire, and in dry conditions, that the fire spreads. And these are hotspot in 2006 locations across the landscape in Kalimantan. Okay, so why do fires occur? Most of you from the temperate parts of the world would think fires happen because of lightning or arson or some silly chap throwing his cigarette, to be kind of gender neutral chap or chapina throwing the cigarette and kind of walking off, resulting in these massive fires. Well, in Kalimantan, Central Kalimantan doesn't really happen. Yeah, chapina is a weird word I made up. Okay, but I'm saying that because people are like, what, chapina? What in heavens is that? Okay, so diverse group actually use fires regularly. This is not an accident. You have small-scale farmers, both Sweden. How many of you heard of slash and burn farming? Oh, lovely. Okay, I won't go into that. So slash and burn farmers still are there in Central Kalimantan. By law, they're kind of forbidden, but that's part of the local culture, so they do it. Then also, this is not to kind of blame only the Sweden farmers. We also have sedentary farmers who want to clear land. They're given a property, they're given 2 hectares, and they can actually go and clear land. And the easiest way is to set fire. After you remove the more valuable trees, you kind of set fire. Then you have land speculators, are all urban-based, and one way in the kind of land regulatory system in Indonesia, you need to show that you're actually using the land. So what these guys do is, because it's meant for speculation, they don't have any intention of actually using the land. Every year they go and kind of set fire to it and kind of walk away. Sometimes in drier years, it kind of the fire spreads. Then you have plantations, both community and company owned, both local and MNCs, multinational, both kind of Indonesian multinationals as well as Malaysian, Singapore. And this is a very point of kind of huge bone of contention between these countries. So each one blaming the other. Oh, it's your companies, it's your companies. But I think all of them used to do much more. Now there is, for several years, there has been a fiat from the president saying plantations should not be using fire, and many countries do follow that. Some countries don't. I mean, not countries, companies don't. And they use fire because it's the most efficient and least financial cost. It's really, really difficult. We have actually gone and measured what would it take to actually cut a hectare of peat forest fires. Okay, massive amounts of labor. I have the data someplace. So there are multiple interests over peat forests that get expressed in the use of fire. Quickly, you have the Dayak people. You have many Dayak communities within. It's not just one set of people. There are many kind of tribal affiliations within. The rural non-Dayaks from Java, Madura, this is just in Central Kalimantan, urban speculators, companies, provincial governments, they all look at peat forest with a slightly different angle. For some, it is their life, culture, livelihood. For climate change NGOs, there used to be carbon cowboys running around the countryside here, promising people carbon funds. For them, it's really just carbon stock. They want to keep the carbon stock on the ground. For environmental NGOs, is orangutan conservation. So it's important when you actually look at what's the nature of challenges and risks to development from climate, you need to understand that not all of them are looking at as for example, in this case, this resource in the same way. They all have very multiple sets of interests. And to be really effective in policy and to build the right kind of institutions, to have the right economic incentives, you need to understand that. Otherwise, you'll wonder, how come they're not using our fine set of kind of, I don't know, programs, projects, are not kind of really making the set of impact that we expected them. So there are also diverse social relations to peat forest fires. A lot of anthropologists have kind of studied this, how for some it's really just for clearing land, primary and secondary forests. Annual burning, as we said, landowners, and palm oil plantations is illegal clearing forest. And the government has very different responses. For district and provincial, they're not really interested right now in the anticipatory. They want to suppress forest fires. When it happens, they go bombard it with water, with these massive helicopters kind of flying. Forest Ministry thinks that by having a ban, somehow they've gotten rid of forest fires, because they have a ban on forest fires. They say, okay, we have kind of done a bit. They have, so it's more complex than that. And now there's a very important, last several years, Norway-Indonesia partnership, where Norway has promised Indonesia $1 billion, like the one for Brazil. for an REDD plus partnership. And for them, it's really focused for Central Kalimantan pilot program is on fire prevention. And through our kind of several years of work here at the Earth Institute with colleagues from IRI, CGST, and other parts of the Earth Institute, working very closely with our partners in Bogor Agriculture University, IPB, and with government partners, we have established that actually the fire hotspots increase significantly in dry years. In the equatorial areas, as in Central Kalimantan, it rains even in the dry area, in the dry season. Okay, so, but when you have below normal dryness, as you see here, I think the next one has better. Yeah. See, this is kind of dry years. This is rainfall anomaly. Dry years, there is an increase in the number of fires. Dry years has more fires. Okay, and the only source of moisture for peat is from rainfall, not for aquifers. Okay, because of the physicality of the peat. So we can predict up to 2 months ahead what's likely to happen for the rainfall. And because of that, we actually have a good handle on the vulnerability and risk to forest fires. So we can actually predict forest fires up to 2 months in advance. And what now, in our kind of building resilience to risks, what we're now working on is how do you kind of plan ahead for dry season. Right now, they just focus on fire suppression. After the fires have occurred, they kind of go around trying to kind of put it out. We're trying to kind of say plan ahead for the dry season. Every dry season is going to be the same. Some dry seasons are going to be drier than others. Okay, so how do you reduce forest fires? We need to implement incentives and penalty enforcement. We need to have a closer community government partnership. We are kind of working through some of these. Utilize the best science there is for an early warning response system. Okay, so and direct budgets for anticipatory. So this is focusing on the immediate. If you go there and say, well, our models indicate that there's going to be a gradual drying of Central Kalimantan because of you're likely to get over the coming decades, less and less rain. You're unlikely to get any attention of any policymaker. They're going to say, look, we have enough trouble right now. You're talking about 50 years from now. We want to kind of do development now. So it's always important in risk management adaptation to begin with what are the current set of development challenges. And sometimes it may have very little to do with climate. Then you cannot insist that climate is the most important driver, right? So you need to recognize that in many parts of the world, climate is important, but you need to implicate that amongst a larger set of development risks that the policymakers, the communities, the NGOs are working. Okay, so this is what we're doing right now. We're just focusing on how do you plan ahead in the kind of the seasonal timescale, and not kind of really talking about climate change. In the short to medium, that is year to several years out ahead, you need to kind of begin to adapt what are the sustainable development pathways. It's clear that we need to have a land use that reflects the criticality of drying of peat. We can't really do it as though peat is similar to mineral forest in some other part of Indonesia. And we need to plan infrastructure for what are these kind of new and emerging climate as well as environmental risks. You need to step back and say, okay, what are the likelihood of these risks emerging? What needs to be done? How do the current land use plans reflect that? Do they at all? Most of them don't. You need to have, for the few, agroforestry based, because you look at the larger trends of urbanization all over the world, you're going to have more and more people in urban areas. You may have a very romantic view that you need to have people living close to nature, hugging trees, rushing around. Unlikely to happen. You're going to have less and less people in rural areas, more and more people in urban areas. So you're going to have agroforestry-based livelihoods. And you can actually intensify agroforestry-based livelihoods for the many, but unlikely that you'll have that many people in Central Kalimantan, say 30 years from now, living in the rural areas. So you're going to have natural kind of peat forest-based economy connected to more urban labor-intensive. You need to have more urban labor-intensive that is really focused on service sector, service industry, connected to the larger economy. Right now, the connection is only through extractive industries. That's the kind of Central Kalimantan connection to the rest of Indonesian economy and to the world. You need to kind of begin to kind of change that. And this doesn't happen overnight. This doesn't happen with our kind of fine selves writing policy briefs. Okay, this is actually kind of hard work, connecting, working across these silos of departments. And you need to have a lot more community and private sector. Many of these cases that kind of ranged against each other, you really need to have a lot more. So a key thing we are now doing is to help leverage the Norwegian Indonesian USD $1 billion partnership. There is a pilot going on in Central Kalimantan, so how to best make use of that. They're not going to provide $1 billion for this, but it's only part. So how to kind of make use of that, and also utilize the self-interest of neighboring regional by regional I meant the larger region, Singapore, Malaysia, to make sure that there is a more sustainable use of these peat forest areas. For them, it kind of impacts them every year. It impacts them in the dry season. So you really need to work across these kind of spatial scales. CODA is just that what we're doing right now. We're actually putting together a national forest fire early warning policy and planning system in place that involves several sets of activities. One is working with IPB, or Bogor Agriculture University, and the National REDD Plus agency, working with many ministries. We actually are kind of coming up with anticipatory system for forest fire vulnerability and risk that actually puts out on the web in Bahasa and tailor-made for different decision makers the risk of forest fires. Right now, they use non-dynamic forest fire information to suppress forest fires through what are called Mangala Agnis. But so now we're kind of improving on that. Importantly, framing, understanding of how institutions work or don't work, how they're connected, and how to kind of actually have a meaningful anticipatory policy that can be executed at national, provincial, down to district levels. What are the heart of any behavioral change is incentives, as well as the stick, both carrot and stick. So we're kind of designing an institutional economic incentive system to kind of do kind of both. How to kind of that, because Indonesian government has so far been really kind of focused on the penalty system. And given the kind of the weakness of the state, as you go away from Jakarta into the province, into the district, into the sub-district village, the state gets kind of weaker and weaker. So we need to understand how to kind of integrate that with community structures as well as with kind of incentives. We have identified many ways of alternatives for fire use. And unfortunately, none of them are as good as a jolly good fire. Okay, because each of them have kind of problems. If only our science proved, oh, this is the best alternative, fire is always kind of second best, then we are up and running. But unfortunately, it's a matter of juggling. Now, one kind of go into it, but there are lots of very interesting ones that has been tried out, but they always kind of come out second best. So we need to we cannot ban the use of fire because that will never work. People will kind of then begin to use fire. So the thing to do is how do you modify the behavior? How do you modify so that they don't set fire in the dry season, or they don't presume that somehow there is local knowledge that will control fires because that local knowledge has been fractured. So we recognize there's a multiplicity of authorities. We need to recognize rather than say, rather than take the normative stance that the government is in charge and we just work with government, things will happen. No, we need to work with governments. Important to work with ministries and departments, recognize both the responsibilities as well as their kind of lack of capacity, and kind of work with them. For example, the ADAT, which is the social regulations, is very important for the local Dayak farmers, but they're much less important for immigrants, and there are tens of thousands of immigrant farmers. So for them, it's really patron-client relationship. So you cannot really just insist that, oh yeah, we're going to have the local ADAT set up, take care of this. That's only for part of your landscape. Another important part of the landscape is not kind of dictated by ADAT regulations. Okay, and Bupati, who is elected, the district head is elected, he's responsible. He or she is responsible for local government. You cannot say, you know what, freeze. You're not going to have any development in these peat forest areas. They're too valuable. That's not going to happen. So you need to work with the responsible agencies, understanding what's the nature of the responsibility, accountability, and then leveraging that for kind of local development. We are working with diverse institutions, users of peat forests, fire risk institutions, village to national policies, regulations. All of this gets in the way of kind of these very clean lines of kind of program lines. Some of you have been kind of program managers. Many of you have executed programs. And you know, with the introduction of every new institution, it gets even more complex. But we need to recognize that that's what needs to be done. We cannot just wish them away. We cannot say we're going to only work with forest ministry. Fine, you may have some limited purchase, but unlikely that you'll actually be changing behavior kind of on the ground, which ultimately will impact forest fire, impact local livelihoods, and as well as has regional kind of carbon and global carbon implications. So this is the last slide, I think. So in the practice of managing risks for sustainable development, climate, as we know, recognized increasingly is an important driver of kind of new risks. So we need to have the best of science to drive solutions for a changing climate. You can't kind of give up science. Okay? So the whole emphasis of this class is how to kind of bring in the best science for solutions, right? But at the same time, we need to plan in an uncertain world. Uncertain not only in the sense of kind of changing climate, but for example, societies are unequal and they seem to be fragmenting even further. So when you kind of talk about your programs, you really need to kind of make sure that it has a traction. There is, in many parts of the world where you have worked or where you come from, there is almost a desperation for economic development. So we need to recognize that and work with that. We cannot tell people that, no, now, sorry, there is a carbon budget, global carbon budget, and your country has this budget, and work with that. Sorry, no economic development. And no, sorry, we can't really give you the intellectual property right on all these cool new technologies that can decouple carbon from energy production because it costs money. You guys don't have money. It doesn't quite work that way. You need to either kind of resource these low carbon pathways, make available the science, or you need to kind of work with them to make real their kind of development aspirations. You also have a large systems of emergent new climate and environmental risks, which I've highlighted in this talk. And you need to realize there is both opportunities as well as sharp limitation to state and market. Increasingly, it seems to be polarized in this debate that people say, oh, you need to know, state is hopeless, get rid of the state, get rid of government, go with the market. Or people who say, no, you guys are idiots. Market is evil, pure, distilled, instead of civility, evility? No, there is no evility. But anyway, so you know what I'm getting at. So evilness personified. So you need to work with the state and with local civil society, romanticize all that. You need to work. Last one is in your work, whether it's managing climate risks or on health, education, work based on empirics, where conviction is very important, passion is important, based on empirics, based on data, not on ideology, and not on normative set of ideas of, oh, this should be what should be, and I'm going to work on that. It's always is useful to have a goal, but based on kind of empirics. And just here, it's just a district. Already, we can see that the vulnerability is going to be increasing over the coming years. The risks to fire are going to be kind of growing more and more. So we need to kind of have a better sense of how we're going to work with all these institutions. Additional slide? No, I think that's fine. Okay, so that's it. Denise, now for some questions.
So you just select whichever one you have.
Okay, what is this? How do you perceive the differences between a resilience-based framework and an adaptation-based framework? They're now the same. Okay, thank you. No, because there's too much of this thing done about resiliency. We have done some reading. If you remember Holling's article on resiliency building and adaptation, there is a whole lot early adaptation literature talked about maladaptation and so on. These are all kind of important theoretical pieces. But for practice oriented, when you talk about adaptation, it's building resiliency, building social and economic resiliency. Okay, done. Investors, what? Did I miss part of that? Under a set of climate change scenarios that are so different one from another, how would you advance convince policymakers? Okay, this is a good one. Yeah, this always happens. I'll select. IPCC uses kind of a couple of dozen global climate models, and each of them is different. Each of them is different because of what goes in and also the starting conditions. So now there are sophisticated approaches to kind of do multi-model ensembling. So you may have to kind of weed out some of the more kind of wacko ones, but there is a multi-model ensemble where you can basically say what's the nature of kind of future climate. And important when you talk about climate change, you also need to look at the set of assumptions and go into kind of the economics of the, the likely futures. So it is less and less the case now in the climate science community, is less and less the case that you have diametrically opposing climate science driven models. They more or less agree. They may for policymakers, there is a set of established kind of practices put out by the IPCC that says this is what ensemble of models are kind of showing. So it is less the case that you need to depend on one model or the other. It seems that we already have evaluated resilience to climate. What would be the closest way to integrate? This is I don't quite understand. Maybe the person is suggesting that we already know what resiliency is and how to get up a system in place to help poor people. Yeah, so that, I mean, that was part of the lecture is you can't really focus on kind of the dominant, for example, the current system in many parts of the world can be extractive. We need to kind of go beyond that into a portfolio of risk kind of management economic activities, and can't really just go with what we have. And as we have kind of pointed out, you really need to kind of work with kind of local communities, but not exclusively. Local communities are part and parcel of a larger kind of socioeconomic system. So you need to work with the private sector as well as with these sets of kind of government agencies. You mentioned the cumulative effects of small-scale farming encouraging.
Can you click them?
Oh, sorry. Okay.
And then click select now.
There is a method to the madness here. You mentioned the cumulative effects of small-scale farmers and encouraging deforestation. Okay. Policy do you think are actually? Yeah, this is a tough one because the transmigration program in Indonesia into Central Kalimantan was ill thought of. It was a terrible idea to actually have people from Java, Madura, who come from a very different set of kind of connections to the local ecology, very used to having hundreds of years of agriculture practice, to come into this kind of extremely acidic soil, where after the first couple of seasons, the productivity just kind of goes down, and you don't really have, it's not sustainable to have kind of farming there of the kind that they're trying to do. What we do have actually is extremely important models that are already there, agroforestry based, amongst the dayaks. You have kind of rubber, rattan, with some amount of rice, upland rice. There already are these models, but there are limits to what can be done with them. So many good institutions in the region are working on how to improve these models, both Indonesian and regional. For example, the 3G system has been working for years on how to improve productivity of these agroforestry systems in ICRAF and C4 and others. So there are ways of kind of getting farmers away from doing the kind of farming, for example, rice, intensive rice, Javanese style rice farming, which is simply not sustainable, both at a local sense as well as in the provision of inputs and subsidies. The government just cannot subsidize these programs. Aside from efforts in the program on the ground, wow, this will take me a year. Good question. No, but there are some efforts. There are lots of efforts tied up to kind of national governments that are doing efforts in response to UNFCCC. You may have heard of NATCOM's National Communication Strategies that every country has to come up with. They also have at the end of it a set of adaptation projects and programs. Unfortunately, some of them have not been well thought of. It is just a favorite programs of governments that they want kind of from funding from a long time, so they just kind of put them up. Some of them have hardly anything to do with kind of climate, but that's kind of one area. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, all of the regional development banks have been kind of have very large programs in helping design infrastructure, in kind of helping urban as another big area for kind of risk managing of urban risks. So there are lots of activities kind of going on, and it's good that it is going on in kind of in plurality, in kind of in multiple arenas, because the problem with kind of centralizing this is if you get it wrong, then your entire effort is kind of wasted. So right now, there seems to be a profusion of activities, and I think it's best left that way. I think we're kind of done. Folks in the distant parts of the world must be ready to sign off. The last question, threat is global, but resilience is very localized. Yep. Yeah, that's one of the issues. Climate change as a global manifestation has kind of global threat and implications, but the way the risk and the vulnerability plays out is extremely local. And this is why we have in the UNFCCC this whole idea of common but differentiated responsibility, that you have countries that had no part in putting up this over the last 150 years carbon in the atmosphere. Now they're getting impacted by the enhanced climate variability, and they don't have the capacity to adapt. And so there is a set of processes in place to make sure of transferring resources, transferring in theory kind of good science and technology in order to kind of do precisely that. That we need to have local resiliency. You cannot build up kind of global resiliency at an abstract global level. So that's why in this class, I didn't really kind of deal with building kind of global resiliency. There are lots of tools that you can actually begin to employ at kind of local, national, and kind of regional scales. There are many kind of large scale programs one can do, but end of the day, it's building resiliency at the local level. So thank you. And now we're going to break for 15, 10, maybe 10, 12 minutes, and then come back for some fabulous set of discussion. Goodbye.